Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Hello, Bill O'Brien, and it is a pleasure to be with you on this, our third program this week. It is a Wednesday, and it is a pleasure to be with you, as it always is. And we are in the midst of a storm here in southern West Virginia right now, and I'm hoping that our power holds. So far it has, and I've been assured that it's not coming through the microphone. So we're having some pretty strong winds and heavy rain here, but hopefully we'll be fine and it'll pass over. Compared to what folks in the middle of the country are experiencing, we're very fortunate, and I think we need to count ourselves as very fortunate and never lose sight of that fact. It's the old idea that no matter how bad things look, somebody else is always in a lot worse shape, and I think that's a very, very important thing to keep in mind always. It is a pleasure to be with you again. Let me begin our program by giving you our phone number and encouraging you to give us an opportunity to hear your ideas and your suggestions and comments and criticisms and different perspectives and reaction to some of the things that we've said on this program or previous programs or whatever. I would love to get, if you are so inclined, and you would like to see us go in a particular direction in this series, then by all means let me know. If I can do it, I'm more than willing to head in the direction that you feel will be most beneficial for you. And my sense is that if you as an individual feel that way, then it is likely that others will agree with you and have the same sense of direction and priority as you do. So again, our number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My personal email address, if you'd like to email me directly, I would welcome and be honored to read your email and to commit to the idea that as much as possible I will try to respond to any questions or suggestions or ideas that you might have that you share with me in email, and I promise that I will make every effort to respond to you in kind. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. I have to say that it's going to take me a few moments to get my head back into the 18th century a little bit. I was engaged in some conversation this afternoon that I don't enjoy. I was talking with the organization that is sitting on top of my retirement funds and talking about various options available when my retirement from Concord University becomes effective at the end of June, so for the better part of an hour and close to an hour and 20 minutes, I think, I was engaged in conversation about money and about income needs and what we have and what we owe and all of those things. I just love to think about those things. And I wondered if you pick up that clap of thunder that we just heard. Hopefully, this thing will move over very quickly. Anyway, I spent the last hour and a half or so looking at contemporary economic situations related to myself personally and my wife, obviously. And it's going to take me a little bit of time to kind of get my head back into the 18th century, but usually it doesn't take long. There's something about, I believe, about this material, the subject matter, and the depth, the numbers of questions and insights that it raises, that excites me and gets my head into that period quite easily. So I'm assuming that my ailment, for lack of a better term, will be temporary, and that I have the antidote for it, and the antidote for it is this program, at least for me. I hope that you will find today's program, as I always do, worth your valuable time. And again, I want to emphasize, before we get into the material itself in any way, please don't feel that once we get into the material that I don't like to create the illusion or the impression that we're operating from a script here that is so rigid that we can't interrupt it and take a call from you, or have you ask a question or make a comment or offer a suggestion or whatever. The intent, obviously, and I've been thinking about this a little bit, obviously there's only so far, if we consider these 2-hour blocks of time together, if I'm doing the most of the talking, which has been true up to now, there's only so far I can go with this. I mean, at some point in time, the whole purpose of this is to ultimately is to intrigue you or challenge you or entice you to become involved. Because the whole purpose of this virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, anyway, whenever anybody asks me, I tell them that it's community education and outreach. That's the #1 objective of this. It is not lecture. It is not a college class. It is not a graduate school class. It is not intended that way, and I hope it will not remain that way. The purpose of this is to pique your interest to the point that we can begin to engage in the kind of dialogue and discussion that will bring more and more people into it and will basically establish connections or meaningful links between the material that I'm introducing here and the concerns that you have about the nation, about contemporary society, about the world we live in, about some of the problems we face, about some of the prospective ways to solve those problems or try to. I am assuming that the bulk of our time is eventually going to be give and take and back and forth, with the idea that all of us will come away from this having learned something. And what I mean is that we can learn from each other. And your insights, your questions, your ideas are obviously, from my perspective, as insightful and as perceptive as our mine. I believe that firmly, and I think our program and our time together will demonstrate that. That, as a listener of the Head On Radio Network itself, as a person who is interested in the world that we live in and the problems it faces, and principally that you are interested in the people who comprise this world and finding ways to make their life just a little bit better, perhaps. That's what drives me, and I'm assuming that it drives you as well. And the mere fact that you are tuned into this network or tuned into this program specifically tells me that that's where your head is as well as mine. And that means that we've got quite a bit in common. And it's just going to be a matter of time before we begin to share our ideas and share perspectives and raise questions, you with me and me with you. And all of us will come away from this much richer for the experience. That's the assumption on which this entire series was proposed. That's the assumption on which the Head On Radio Network has given us the on-air time to basically make this dream become a reality. And so at some point in time, it's going to happen. And what I want you to know is, please don't feel that you need to wait and wait and wait and wait for an opportunity, for the optimum time to make that call or pick up that phone, because it may never come. The fact of the matter is, when you are inclined, when you have an idea or a thought or a perspective or a question or whatever, that automatically makes it the optimum time. The time to make the call is then, is right then. And so, as much as possible, I'm going to try to make the phone number so familiar to you that you will just pick up the phone and dial as if you were dialing your own spouse or your children or your best friend or whatever. Because that's what I want this to be. And so when people ask me what the overall objective or the overall goal is for a virtual center on the study of the Constitution, my answer is the ultimate purpose of this is community education and outreach. And I usually, if pressed, I will usually follow it with the following explanation. There are centers all over the place at universities and colleges in this country and outside this country devoted to research and to the study and to the scholarship associated with the Constitution of the United States and the role of the court in interpreting that Constitution. They are there. But it has been my experience over the years that most of these centers and most of the people who are housed in them are devoted to the idea of sharing their ideas with other scholars and other professionals. These people are writing and thinking and researching and sharing ideas with each other. But the general assumption has been that the audience for this kind of conversation is limited. And you almost have to be degreed in order to basically gain admission into this dialogue, into this conversation. It is my feeling that the society we live in and the nature of the political system in which we are fortunate enough to reside, this republic, which is built around the idea of the participation of citizens in the government which governs them, it is my belief that by definition the role of citizen means that all of us need to understand more about the system and about our role in it than we do now. All of us need to go there. And that ultimately, if there was ever a political system in the history of the world that whose success was contingent, was directly connected to the education level and understanding of the citizens themselves, it's this one. And my feeling is we are long past the time when educating our citizenry, really educating our citizenry on the nature of this political system, what its intent was, what the founders wanted, what the reality is, what we have, what we can make out from what we have, all of it is basically in our hands. And it's time we all basically sucked it up and began to basically get involved and begin to learn things that we didn't learn before. That's what this is about. And so in a sense, it is community education and outreach. It's basically trying to do something about the level of misunderstanding or out-and-out ignorance about the nature of our political system. There are too many people out there that know almost nothing. Worse than that are the people out there who think they know, but what they know is not accurate. And the combination of those two situations, of those two things, makes not only them vulnerable to a persuasive argument, but it makes us vulnerable as well, because they vote and they have the same role in participating in decision-making as you and I have. And so in a sense, it's important that the more of us out there who really understand and know what this is about, the better off we'll all be. To directly go to the preamble of the Constitution, my feeling is greater understanding and greater appreciation for the founders, the vision, the ideals, the principles, and the work of our founders for all of us is in the public interest. It is a classic example of finding ways to promote the general welfare. We will come closer to the general welfare as we come closer to an appreciation and an understanding of the system we are in and the responsibilities of citizenship associated with it. That's my feeling. That's what this program is about. I believe that you agree. The fact that you are there right now suggests to me that you agree. And I appreciate you being here. So let me end this by, again, giving you the phone number. It is area code 304-658-3333. 304-658-3333. Just a brief review or touching base a little bit to kind of pick up where we were yesterday so that we can go on. I have a somewhat different topic in mind today. I suggested it yesterday, and it basically addresses the very important issue of Charles Beard and his economic interpretation of the Constitution, which I think everybody's heard about, everybody knows. Some people know a little bit more than others. So my sense is that what I wanted to do today was touch on it and make sure that everybody was clear on what Beard said, on what Beard didn't say, on what the critics of Beard tried to suggest that he said, and basically look at that situation and whether, in fact, the things that Beard said are still relevant at all in the 21st century. He published his economic interpretation of the Constitution in 1913, 100 years ago. 100 years ago. Obviously, for many, many years after Beard's economic interpretation was published, up until after World War II, as much as some scholars did not want to accept or believe the things that Beard said about the Constitution of the United States, the fact of the matter is it was so powerful, so overwhelming, that even the people that didn't want to agree with it were forced to admit that we needed to take it seriously. But after World War II, and especially after the outbreak of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, suddenly Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution became something that patriotism and nationalism and support for the nation itself almost seemed to dictate to certain people that we had to find a way to refute this. That everything we wanted to believe about our country, everything we wanted to believe about the founders, everything we wanted to believe about the political system we live in, everything we wanted the rest of the world to know about us, and why, if put in a position of making a choice, they would choose our way rather than the communist way. It almost became a matter of faith to many people that they had to find ways to tear into Beard and to effectively destroy his economic interpretation of the Constitution. Many people took on that challenge. Some people were more successful doing it than others. And there's no question, by the time we reached the 1980s, by the time we got through the Reagan administration and we're moving into the 90s, into what becomes the Clinton years in the 1990s, many professional historians believed that Charles Beard's economic interpretation had effectively been put to rest, that it had been effectively refuted, and that the things that Beard said about the Constitution and about the founders, once and for all, had been taken care of. That we had essentially fulfilled our mission as a nation, which is to take this very negative, critical, cynical approach to the founders, which many people who read Beard chose to believe it was, and we had successfully refuted it. And so the major study the first major study to take on Beard was Robert E. Brown's study of Massachusetts during the Confederation period and the move into the constitutional period, into the Constitutional Convention. And Robert E. Brown's book on Massachusetts basically is not an effort, and I think this is very important to know. Beard's study is a study of Massachusetts politics in the 1780s into the 1790s. But its ultimate objective is not to uncover or make known additional further information about Massachusetts history or American history. Its agenda was to destroy the economic interpretation thesis of Charles A. Beard. And many people bought into Brown's thesis because clearly Brown was able to gain access to resources to research opportunities that Beard didn't even have. And so, I mean, you know, Brown wrote in the 1950s and 60s, as I recall. And so the number of research opportunities that became available to scholars between 1913 and the 1950s was incredible. And so the fact of the matter is Brown was able to refute many aspects and many assumptions and conclusions and pieces of evidence that Beard focused upon as being, you know, research examples of what he believed to be truth as he knew it. And then after Brown's study, which got a lot of national attention, Brown became very, very prominent in the field because of his study of Massachusetts and his ability to take on and successfully apply a good old-fashioned whipping, as we would say, to Charles Beard. Then along came Forrest McDonald from the state of Alabama, and Forrest McDonald's very famous book, which is a direct refutation of Charles Beard's economic interpretation, and his book is entitled "We the People." And Forrest McDonald goes into the detail and looks at the follow-up detail and the information that has surfaced in the years and decades since Beard wrote his economic interpretation. And Forrest McDonald looks into not only the background and the personal interests and economic interests of the 55 delegates at the Constitutional Convention who ultimately signed the Constitution of the United States. But McDonald actually goes into the states and begins to look at the economic interests of the 1,648 people who sat in state ratifying conventions that ratified the Constitution and asked the same research questions of them as he had asked and as Beard asked of the 55 delegates at the Constitutional Convention. And so what Forrest McDonald was able to do, and of course when he wrote, we had much more sophistication. We weren't into the computer age quite, but we had technology available that would allow you, with punch cards and various other things, to conduct voter roll call analysis votes in state legislatures, in ratifying conventions, at the Constitutional Convention, where it became possible to run vote after vote after vote in order to see who voted with certain people and who voted opposite other certain people at particular points in time. And what he was able to do then was to draw conclusions about groups of people that tended to vote together on specific issues based on roll call analysis. This was something that Byrd didn't, I keep saying Byrd, Charles Beard did not have access to. And there's no question that what Forrest McDonald was able to do was to refute some of the conclusions that Beard had made, because many of the conclusions and observations that Beard made were made on a degree of evidence quite lacking compared to what was available, resources were available to Forrest McDonald many, many years later. And so consequently, much of his research did refute some of the conclusions and observations that Beard made. So Forrest McDonald became very, very prominent, and he's an excellent late 18th century historian. There's absolutely no question. I've read the stuff that he writes. It's incredible. And the combination of the Robert Browns and the Forrest McDonalds and the Edward S. Corwins, who's a political scientist, but Corwin makes the comment. I find this to be particularly relevant at one point, and I'm thumbing through a book I have here, because there's a statement in here by Edwin Corwin that I wanted to share with you about a comment he makes about Charles Beard, which I think not only gives you an indication of the criticisms of Beard, but also the tone of those criticisms. I mean, this project of refuting Beard became, so important to so many people that that the tone of the attack became personal. I mean, it wasn't far from emphasizing the importance to the nation of challenging some of the findings that Beard reached, some of the conclusions that Beard reached. It wasn't that far from going from there to the point of destroying Beard as a historian. To, in other words, making the attack personal, not only destroying the conclusions of Beard, but destroying the credibility of Beard. In other words, raising questions about whether, in fact, Beard was enough of a scholar to even warrant serious consideration of some of the conclusions that he reached. And at one point, and I'm having trouble finding that, oh, no, I have it right here. And this will just give you an example. This is from Edwin Corwin, who's a political scientist. He basically took on Charles Beard, and basically he took on some of Beard's conclusions about the founders, those founders who had invested in public securities and then redeemed them under the new Constitution, but more specifically under Hamilton's financial program in the early 1790s. And many of these speculators in public securities became very, very wealthy in the process. And basically, Corwin makes the point that Beard's assumptions, which led him to some of his conclusions, Corwin termed the most unmitigated rot. And then he says there was a strong possibility that many of the public securities that Beard makes so much of were purchased after the Constitutional Convention adjourned as speculative investment rather than investments prior to the convention that dictated how the particular delegate voted within the convention. In other words, Beard's argument is that because of the particular investments and holdings of certain members of the Constitutional Convention, that personal interest dictated what they supported, what they opposed, and how they voted. And what Corwin concludes is that many of the people who did indeed speculate in public securities and investments bought these as speculative ventures after the Constitution was ratified rather than owning them before. Therefore, Beard's assumption that you can predict their voting behavior based on their personal interests was, as Corwin said, the most unmitigated rot. And I think when you say, historians, professional scholars and historians don't usually use that kind of language in talking about their colleagues' research. you know, to stand up at a conference, a professional conference, and basically call the research of a colleague unmitigated rot is pretty powerful. And you don't necessarily hear a lot of that at professional conferences. I got to say very honestly that as civility in American society becomes a lost art in the 21st century, however, Corwin's comment would be much more acceptable today than it was when he made it. But at the time he made it, you didn't do that to colleagues. Today, we've reached the point of sophistication where we feel comfortable saying some pretty bad things about each other in many professions, not just the historical profession. But anyway, that, you know, the point that I'm making is that refuting Beard became almost a crusade among certain historians and political scientists, and those that didn't want, not only didn't accept what Beard concluded, but was so determined to destroy it that they felt no compunction at all about destroying Beard himself in the process. The point that I would make is that despite all of the research of that campaign, the fact of the matter is the idea of the economic interpretation as a thesis continues to survive. It continues to be credible. Granted, many of the observations and many of the things that Beard concluded about specific people or specific groups has been refuted. But while some of his findings and some of his observations were refuted, the idea of an economic interpretation of the constitutions has not been. In fact, the economic interpretation has begun to show new life. And one of the best books that I've found in a long time is written by Alan Gibson, and it's called Understanding the Founding, The Crucial Questions. And Alan Gibson is a historian from California. He's at one of the state colleges in California, one of the state university branches, and I can't remember which one it is. It might be on the book jacket. I'm not sure, but anyway, Alan Gibson is not a historian. He's a political scientist, but he has published 2 books on the founding and trying to understand the founding and why the founding has become such a topic of interest of late within the last 10, 12, 15 years. And of course, I think we know that that is true. And I have found Gibson's books to be incredibly insightful and incredibly and very honestly, incredibly fair. Alan Gibson was a fellow at the James Madison Institute at Princeton University, which is a very conservative group of scholars. And I've been to a number of their conferences, as I've mentioned before, and Alan Gibson, in the last 2 conferences that I attended, Alan Gibson made presentations. And in both of those, it's very clear that Alan Gibson is well respected among his colleagues there, even though most of them don't agree with him. In fact, the last time I heard him speak, he made the statement that he continues to be a liberal in a field of conservatives. But he is very, very appreciative of the fact that they take him seriously, they talk with him honestly, they accept him, they accept his scholarship, and they basically accept his point of view as being legitimate and well-intended. They don't agree with him, but at the same time, they like him and they respect him. And he's great. He's very appreciative of that, as he should be. I found that to be very encouraging. I found the fact that Alan Gibson is there. He came out of that organization, and yet he has not bought totally into the entire ideology which drives the group. I found to be very encouraging. The point that I would make is that in Gibson's book entitled Understanding the Founding, one of his early chapters, is a historiographical study of the founding. And in it, his very first chapter is entitled, Still Hazy After All These Years, the Economic Interpretation and the Cloudy Legacy of Empirical Analysis. And he basically presents Beard's thesis, he presents the major critics of Beard's thesis, and he concludes his chapter with what is effectively a rebirth of the economic interpretation thesis. And a couple of political scientists, and again, it's very significant that these are not research historians in this group, and I think that's very, very important. But a recent study of the economic interpretation has revealed that while certain aspects of Beard's research have been questioned, his overall position about an economic interpretation has not been refuted. And so therefore, and the book that I'm referring to let me make sure that I give it its due. The book I'm referring to, the author is Robert McGuire, and the book is entitled To Form a More Perfect Union. And it's kind of a resurrection of the idea of the economic interpretation. And it basically makes the point that despite all the criticisms, despite the professional crusade against Beard that undertook the history profession throughout the Cold War, from the end of World War II almost up until the year 2000. The fact of the matter is, certain aspects of Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution continue to thrive. And let me share these with you, and then we'll go back and we'll take a look at Beard, because I think it's really helpful. Despite all the criticism and all the research that is aimed at refuting Beard, this is basically what Alan Gibson's review of the historiography concludes. Nevertheless, several important dimensions of a modified neo-progressive interpretation remain strong in the face of limited historical data and a century of critical analysis. First, in other words, these things about Beard still live, despite efforts to destroy them. First, Beard's proposition that the movement for the Constitution was begun by an elite group of men who were disproportionately wealthy, urban, and commercial in their interests, and that they were responding to threats to their economic interests from within the states, is perhaps the strongest dimension of his thesis, and it continues to prevail. We'll go back into this in some detail in a moment. Second, although studies of the voting patterns at the Constitutional Convention are limited, they suggest that the Constitution can be thought of as an economic document, at least in the sense that it was meant to abolish the currency system of finance that had been adopted by many states during the mid-1780s, and to promote and protect commercial interests. So in that sense, Beard was right on. And third, empirical research supports the progressive and the neo-progressive proposition that support for the Constitution came disproportionately from delegates who represented commercial coastal regions, and that the opposition was led by delegates representing the interior. Indeed, there has been solid continuity over the past century for this geographic interpretation of ratification, which contains a modified class interpretation. So in those three major areas, nobody has been able to refute Beard. And I think that's incredibly significant since so many have tried. It seems to me, in our efforts to better understand the founders and what the founders created, specifically the document they framed in 1787 at Philadelphia, to claim that we are about better understanding the Constitution of the United States and not dealing with Charles Beard would be a huge mistake. It would, in effect, raise serious questions about how serious our intent at understanding really was. It seems to me, then, that we are almost required to look seriously at the suggestions and at some of the research of Charles Beard and try to understand what he was saying, and at the same time to appreciate what he was not saying. Because if ever there was a thesis, a historical thesis, that was susceptible to creating straw men, it's Charles Beard. In other words, a favorite tactic of critics, in history at least, has always been to basically accuse your opponents of saying things and writing things that they didn't really say or write, and then refuting them. In other words, setting up a straw man. You'll remember not too long ago in our programs, we were looking at the article on the Constitutional Convention as an assembly of demagogues, which was Thomas Jefferson's phrase. And in that particular review, in that particular article, Jefferson's positive approach to the convention as an assembly of demagogues was countered with reference to Charles Beard's economic interpretation as cynical, sexist, racist, self-interested, and demeaning of the nation and the positive intent of the founders and the positive results of the Constitution they created. And an effort to attack that is what prompted some of the greatest scholars in the country from that point on. The first one, I believe we mentioned before, was William Howard Taft. Pause there for a moment to take just a quick breath. So again, I've done over the years, I've done quite a bit of reading on not only Beard, but on the by the critics of Beard. And after a while, you get so confused by the data that you're swimming in information and data, and you don't know what to believe. And I was there. But one of the things I did in preparation for our program is I went back and reread an article that Beard wrote the year before he published his economic interpretation. In 1912, Beard published an article entitled Framing the Constitution. And in that essay, he went through the 80s, the 1780s. In other words, he reviewed the history of the 1780s that led to the calling of the Constitutional Convention. He touched on the Annapolis Convention of September of '86, and you remember we took a look. We looked at that, and the fact that there were only 5 states, if you remember, that showed up at Annapolis, but Alexander Hamilton saved the day by issuing a call for another convention the following May to meet at Philadelphia for the express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And we talked about the Annapolis Convention, and you'll remember that we looked at the what I think the insightful letter of Otto, the French ambassador in New York during this period, who reported back to France about the Annapolis Convention and how the fact that there was a real, somewhat of a fraud being perpetrated on the American people, that the American people were really unaware as to what was going on and what the real issues were in this move to revise the Articles of Confederation. His position is the idea was to overturn the Articles, which indeed that was the case. And the fact of the matter is, so many people in so many states recognize this, that state after state refused to allow its delegates to attend the convention. It's pretty obvious, if you don't want to be a party to something that you don't support, then the way to do it is to boycott the meeting. If you don't show up, you can't be counted as a supporter of whatever happens there. And that's what happened at Indianapolis, at the Annapolis Convention in September of 1786. Well, in this article, Beard talks about the nature of the convention. He talks about the 80s. He talks about the group of people that wanted to revise the Articles and strengthen the government, in which ultimately these are the people that become the real architects of the Constitution. And he talks about the people opposed to them, and then he talks about the issues and the events leading to the calling of the Constitutional Convention, and he concludes his article with several pages on the ratification process itself. So in other words, this is Charles Beard's survey of the period, and the very next year he's going to come out with his economic interpretation. I think that it is very helpful to try to get some idea, some insight as to what Beard was thinking before he wrote or while he was writing his economic interpretation. I find this particular paragraph to be very telling in that sense. So if you'll permit me, I'd like to read one paragraph from this particular article by Charles Beard, written 1 year before publication of his economic interpretation of the Constitution. Beard says, "Indeed, every page of the laconic record of the proceedings of the convention, preserved to posterity by Mr. Madison, shows conclusively that the members of the Assembly were not seeking to realize any fine notions about democracy and equality, but were striving with all the resources of political wisdom at their command to set up a system of government that would be stable and efficient, safeguarded on the one hand against the possibilities of despotism, and on the other against the onslaught of majorities." What a sentence. Think about that. Here's Beard's overall assessment of what the Constitutional Convention was all about. Every page, he said, of the record, of the laconic record of the proceedings of the convention, preserved to posterity, to us, by James Madison in his notes, shows conclusively that the members of that assembly, the members of the convention, were not seeking to realize any fine notions about democracy and equality, but were striving with all the resources of political wisdom at their command to set up a system of government that would be stable and efficient, safeguarded on the one hand against the possibilities of despotism, and on the other against the onslaught of majorities. In the mind of Mr. Gerry, and he's talking about Elbridge Gerry, of the delegate from Massachusetts, in the mind of Elbridge Gerry, the evils that had experienced flowed from the excess of democracy. Very important comment. Elbridge Gerry said, and this is a quote from Madison's notes, the evils that they had experienced flowed from the excess of democracy. And he confessed that while he was still a Republican, he had been taught by experience that the danger of the leveling spirit. In other words, while he continued to support Republican government, he had become painfully aware of the power of the people when the people are allowed to participate. And usually what happens is there is what he calls a leveling spirit. There's an effort to look at the disparities in society in terms of the inordinate inequality of the distribution of wealth and power, and that logically produces a desire to redistribute in such a way that society becomes more equal, more level, to use his term. And then Beard quotes Edmund Randolph, who's governor of Virginia and who is host of the convention. He issues the welcoming address to the delegates at the Constitutional Convention. Mr. Randolph, in offering to the consideration of the convention his plan of government, which of course is Madison's Virginia plan, Randolph observed, quote, that the general object was to provide a cure for the evils under which the United States labored, that in tracing these evils to their origin, every man had found it in the turbulence and follies of democracy, that some check, therefore, was to be sought for against this tendency of our governments, and that a good Senate seemed most likely to answer the purpose. Mr. Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, in advocating a life term for senators, urged that all communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, and the other the mass of the people who seldom judge or determine right. This is Charles Beard characterizing some of the anti-democratic fears about the people and about the leveling spirit that the people reflect. And he is quoting from Madison's notes of the convention some of the comments that some of the delegates made who become key people in getting the Constitution written and ratified. He cites Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, he cites Edmund Randolph of Virginia, and he cites Alexander Hamilton of New York. Randolph and Gerry both talk about the excesses of democracy. Randolph talks about the turbulence and the follies of democracy, and the extent to which they believe a good Senate can solve the problem. So that these people see the Senate, because it must ratify whatever comes out of the House, as the conservative voice, the kind of check on a runaway Democratic House of Representatives. That's why they insist that the people should not directly vote for senators. And so the Constitution, as originally written, gives state legislatures the power to appoint the state's two senators. It's not until the Constitution is amended in 1913, as part of the progressivism, the progressive movement, so-called, the reform movement, that the people are given the authority to directly vote for the United States senators. I'm moving into the next paragraph in Beard's analysis, because here he quotes a couple of other people. Gouverneur Morris wanted to check, quote, the precipitancy, changeableness, and excess of the representatives of the people by the ability and virtue of men of great and established property, aristocracy. Gouverneur Morris wanted to check the democratic nature of the people by the ability and the virtue of men of great and established property, the aristocracy. Men who from pride will support consistency and permanency. Such an aristocratic body will keep down the turbulence of democracy, unquote. Gouverneur Morris. Then Beard says, while these extreme doctrines were somewhat counterbalanced by the democratic principles of Mr. Wilson, who urged that the government ought to possess not only first the force, but second the mind or sense of the people at large, Madison summed up in a brief sentence the general opinion of the convention when he said, and this is Federalist number 10, when he said, to secure private rights against minority factions, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government, was the great object to which their inquiries had been directed. So Charles Beard is characterizing the nature of the convention, the nature of the people, what the people who are there voting believe they're about, what their mission is, what their purpose is. Beard concludes as follows. They were anxious above everything else to safeguard the rights of private property against any leveling tendencies on the part of the propertyless masses, the poor. Gouverneur Morris, in speaking on the problem of apportioning representatives, correctly stated the sound historical fact when he declared, quote, life and liberty were generally said to be of more value than property. An accurate view of the matter, nevertheless, would prove that property was the main object of society. If property, then, was the main object of government, certainly it ought to be one measure of the influence due to those who were to be affected by government. What a statement directly from Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention. Gouverneur Morris, again, talking about apportioning representatives, stated what he said is sound fact. Life and liberty are generally said to be of more value than property. People say that, but he's suggesting that that isn't true. An accurate view of the matter, he says, nevertheless, would prove that property is the main object of society. If property, then, is the main object of government, certainly it ought to be one measure of the influence due to those who were to be affected by the government. If property is the major issue, then it stands to reason that the people with the most property ought to have the loudest voice. Wow. Rufus King of New York also agreed that, and this is a quote, property was the primary object of society, unquote. Madison warned the convention that in framing a system which they wished to last for ages, they must not lose sight of the changes which the ages would produce in the forms and distribution of property. In advocating a long term in order to give independence and firmness to the Senate, Madison described these impending changes. An increase in the population will of necessity increase the proportion of those who will labor under all the hardships of life and secretly sigh for a more equitable distribution of its blessings. Let me paraphrase that. This is a quote from Madison, as recounted by Charles Beard. As population increases over the years, it will of necessity increase the proportion of those who labor under the hardships of life. There's going to be more poor people than there are rich people, and who secretly sigh for a more equitable distribution of its blessings. It stands to reason, Madison says, that as time goes on and the population of this nation continues to increase, it's going to increase proportionately with more poor people than rich people. And that means that there's going to be a louder and louder call for a more equal distribution of the blessings of this society. As population increases and as the number of poor people increase, concerns about the inequitable distribution of wealth and property in this country are going to increase as well. Madison says we need to expect that, and we need to take precautions to make sure that those cries never produce anything. In advocating, let me go back. In advocating a long term in order to give independence and firmness to the Senate, Madison described these pending changes, and this is the quote that I just read. An increase in the population will of necessity increase the proportion of those who will labor under all the hardships of life and secretly sigh for a more equitable distribution of its blessings. These may in time outnumber those who are placed above the feelings of indigence. We need to expect the fact that the cries of the poor are going to be louder than the feelings of the wealthy. According to the equal laws of suffrage, the power will slide into the hands of the former. Because suffrage, the vote, is distributed equally in society, as time goes on, more and more of the poor people are going to have more and more of the vote. No agrarian attempts have yet been made in this country, but symptoms of a leveling spirit, as we have understood, have sufficiently appeared in a certain quarter to give notice of the future danger, unquote. Now back to Beard. And again, in support of the argument for a property qualification on voters, Madison urged, in future times, a great majority of the people will not only be without land, but without any other sort of property. These will either combine under the influence of their common situation, in which case the rights of property and the public liberty will not be secure in their hands, or, what is more probable, they will become the tools of opulence and ambition, in which case there will be equal danger on another side. Madison is saying is there'll be so many of these people, and their vote, when it combines, will be so powerful that they will be either better able to represent their own interests, or, what is more probable, they will become tools in the hands of the ambitious, of political demagogues who are trying to use their appeal to the poor people as a way to gain power and influence. And that, he points, is an even greater threat. Various projects for setting up class rule by the establishment of property qualifications for voters and officers were advanced in the convention, but they were defeated. So what Beard is pointing out is the priority of some of the delegates, many of the delegates in this convention. Their goal from the very beginning was not to create a system that was democratic and equal. It was to protect the existing society, which was not. And that is the basis on which Beard comes out the next year with his economic interpretation of the Constitution. We have gone beyond the top of the hour. It's 4 minutes after the hour. Let's pause and take 4 or 5 minute break here. We'll come back and we'll spend the rest of our hour looking at Charles Beard and looking specifically at some of the things he alleged and some of the things he wrote. We'll be right back. We are back with you again. This is Bill O'Brien. It's 8 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 45, or a little bit better than 45 minutes left to go in our time together this week. Let me give you, once again, our phone number and encourage you to give folks an opportunity to hear from you. It is area code 304-658-3333. That, again, 304-658-3333. My personal email address, waobrien906 at gmail.com. We've been looking at the words of Charles Beard, and what we've been looking at is an article that he wrote on the entire period leading up to and through the convention and the ratification struggle that followed for the Constitution of the United States. And this article gives us an overview of what Beard is finding in his research, and it's going to basically become the basis for the economic interpretation of the Constitution that he will publish the very next year in 1913. So I think it's very prescient because it gives us some insight into what Beard's priorities were as he was putting together his economic interpretation. So in a sense, much of what he's going to suggest in the economic interpretation is going to be based on what he sees about the process of constitution making that is underway as he's finding it. And he is quoting extensively from Madison's notes on the convention. He is taking Madison's verbatim notes on what particular delegates have said about the intent of the Constitution and about their intent vis-a-vis the class nature of the Constitution that is taking place. And I'm almost reluctant to abandon this look at Charles Beard because it's so insightful, it seems to me. And it highlights much of the research that he's done. And again, remember, this is research done early in the 20th century, 100 years ago. And, of course, the access that we have to resources, and as you know, one of the access points that I've talked about over and over again is the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution project that's been underway at the University of Wisconsin in Madison for the last over 40 years. Started by Merrill Jensen and taken up for the last 39 years by John Kaminsky, by Dr. John Kaminsky, who I am proud to call a good friend. And John and I were in classes together. We studied with Professor Jensen together already. I've mentioned some of that. And so what Beard points out after he mentions what we mentioned, he talks about the idea of property qualifications. And then he acknowledges that the convention did not issue property qualifications for voting, but his point is not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't agree on what those property qualifications ought to be. So what they finally decided to do was leave it up to the states, and whatever each state accepted as its property qualifications for voting, the new Constitution would essentially accept those. Beard points out, for example, that there were differences between Northerners and Southerners on the nature of property itself. So many in the cities especially were investors and financiers and merchants and bankers and attorneys, and so their definition of property would be substantially different than the planter slave owners of the South, who primarily owned real estate, and that was their definition of property. So the inability to come together on a common ground here, so to speak, on the very definition of property qualifications that would work for everybody is the reason that they don't include them, not because they chose not to. So Beard's position is the fact that there is no property qualification for voting and office holding built into the Constitution is not because some of them didn't want to put it in there. It's because they basically couldn't agree on something that would satisfy enough people that it would get in there. So they basically backed off the entire issue. Then Beard says, nevertheless, by the system of checks and balances placed in the government, the convention safeguarded the interests of property against attacks by majorities. Again, majorities, the property less. The House of Representatives, Mr. Hamilton pointed out, was so formed as to render it particularly the guardian of the poorer orders of citizens, unquote, while the Senate was to preserve the rights of property and the interests of the minority against the demands of the majority. And then Beard goes through an extensive coverage of Madison's Federalist Number 10. And we don't need to go there since we've been there. But again, the very last sentence, the last idea that Beard cites from Federalist 10 is that the newly framed Constitution's principal purpose was to secure the rights of property, the rights of the minority, against the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. And you remember we focused on that when we were looking at Federalist Number 10. And then Beard says this very system of checks and balances, which is undeniably the essential element of the Constitution, is built upon the doctrine that the popular branch of government cannot be allowed full sway, and least of all the enactment of laws touching the rights of property. So therefore, the exclusion of the direct vote for election of the president, the indirect election of senators, the president by the Electoral College, the Senate by state legislatures, all of these, Beard says, are testimony to the distrust of the people's ability to create the kind of government that the nation needed in order to begin to recover from the damage done under the Articles of Confederation. And then Beard talks about the Federalist Papers generally. And he says the following: page after page of the Federalist is directed to that portion of the electorate which was disgusted with the mutability of public councils, Madison's vices of the political system. Writing on the presidential veto, Hamilton says, and there's an extensive quote from Alexander Hamilton here. I wanted to share this with you. Writing on the presidential veto, Hamilton says the following: the propensity of the legislative department to intrude upon the rights and absorb the powers of other departments has already been suggested and repeated. It may perhaps be said that the power of preventing bad laws included the power of preventing good ones, and may be used to the one purpose as well as the other. But this objection will have little weight with those who can properly estimate the mischiefs of that inconstancy and mutability in the laws, which form the greater blemish in the character and genius of our governments. Again, Hamilton is attacking the Confederation state governments just as Madison did in Federalist Number 10. They will consider every institution calculated to restrain the excess of lawmaking and to keep things in the same state in which they happen to be at any given period as more likely to do good than harm, because it is favorable to greater stability in the system of legislation. The injury which may possibly be done by defeating a few good laws will be amply compensated by the advantage of preventing a number of bad ones. In other words, he's responding to those who say you put in so many checks and balances in there that you make it almost impossible for the government to do anything. How are we going to expect good things to come out of government if the government is so constrained by checks and balances and separation of powers and vetoes of the president and the Supreme Court? How is it going to enact anything good? And Hamilton's position is the fact that we have built in a protection to keep the bad from becoming law far outweighs the few pieces of good that we might lose in the process. And then Beard moves into the struggle for ratification. So that is, I believe, a fairly accurate look at where Charles Beard is coming from when he writes his economic interpretation. So with that, let's begin to take, it's 20 after the hour, we've got about better than a half an hour. Let's begin to take a look seriously at Charles Beard and his economic interpretation. And Beard begins with a question. he opens up with a question. And this is the way he poses the problem. He says, he writes, what if it could be shown that substantially all of the merchants, moneylenders, security holders, manufacturers, shippers, capitalists, and financiers, and their professional associates are to be found on one side in support of the Constitution, and that substantially all or the majority portion of the opposition came from the non-slave-holding farmers and the debtors. Would it not be pretty conclusively demonstrated, he said, that our fundamental law was not the product of an abstraction known as the whole people, but rather a group of economic interests which must have expected beneficial results from the Constitution's adoption? That's the challenge that Beard proposes as setting the stage for his economic interpretation. What if we could show, and I think the list of interests here is incredible, what if we could show that substantially all of the merchants, all the moneylenders, all the security holders, all the manufacturers, all the shippers, all the capitalists, and all the financiers, and their professional associates, those who were in the same business working with them, what if we were able to show that they're all found on one side in support of the Constitution, while on the other side, most of the people who are opposed to it are small farmers, non-slave-holding farmers, and debtors? Wouldn't that be sufficient, he says, to raise questions about this abstraction known as the whole people? And would it not suggest instead that the Constitution was the product of a group of economic interests which probably expected beneficial results from its adoption? I would suggest to you that none of those who set out to refute Beard's economic interpretation can ever refute that statement, because it is absolutely naive to believe that people as heavily invested and as considerate and conscious of the threats to property, of which they held so much, would put aside all of those private interests, would put aside all of their concerns as expressed in the 1780s, and set out instead to draft a document which would meet some abstract objectives about popular participation and democracy and equality and all of the ideals expressed 10, 12 years earlier by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. You would have to believe in the sugar plum fairy in order to believe that people as well invested in property and wealth and influence as this group would put all of that aside in favor of abstract principles. In other words, it's one thing to argue that people operate 100% out of self-interest. I don't think Beard's saying that. But that's what his critics choose to say he's saying. However, while you can't ever say that anybody acts 100% out of self-interest, I don't think you can realistically say either that anybody acts 100% out of principle to the detriment of their own self-interest. That's naive. That's fantasy. And so the fact of the matter is there's probably an element of self-interest and principle at work here. There's a mix. We would like to believe a healthy mix. Beard's suggesting the mix may be skewed in such a way that it's not as healthy as it could have been. But he's not saying that it's exclusively self-interest. So this idea of self-interested citicism that we saw in that article on an assembly of demagogues that we looked at last week, that's a little bit extreme. That's overkill. In fact, I remember when Bob Kincaid called us during the program at that time, he made the point that it was a straw man, and indeed it was. Because it's never all one or all the other. Nothing in life is. Basically, what life is more than anything else is a succession of hybrids, mixes. And the question is, what we work on is the balance. We may try to alter the balance a little bit in one direction or the other, but rarely does it ever become all one or all the other. I think we're witnessing in society today with groups like the Tea Party and some others, we're looking at the emergence of groups who believe they can do that. They can make it all one and just write off everybody else, everybody that doesn't agree with them. But the fact of the matter is, most of us realize that that's not realistic. So in a sense then, what I would say is that Beard's opening question, the challenge that he poses, is a pretty powerful one. What if I could show that most of the people who supported the Constitution are on this side and most of the people who are opposed it on that side? Wouldn't that cause you to rethink what this document was all about? Can you refute that? It seems to me that any logical thinking person would agree that you would have to take that kind of possibility a bit seriously. And then and then Beard begins to address the most relevant, the most significant issue in Beard, which is the idea of what Beard refers to as personality. And what he's talking about is the changing nature of property. Beard is pointing out what all of us know for sure, that whereas in previous eras, in previous times, in the Middle Ages, property was land, it was real estate, and the people that owned it were realtors. Today, of course, the people that are in real estate sell real estate. They are what we call realtors. But the idea is that people who engage in property defined as real estate, as land, that's one kind of property. But what Beard is saying is that kind of property is passé, that what we're talking about now is a totally different kind of property. And it's what he calls personality. And it involves investments and capital and securities and bonds and high-risk investments and the pursuit of interest and manufacturing and commercial interests and equipment and infrastructure to support the operation of that equipment, roads and canals and all the rest of it. In other words, there is tremendous wealth and power to be gained in the kind of society that is emerging at the time of the Constitutional Convention. And what Beard is saying, it's important to recognize that, because it's that kind of property that Hamilton is talking about in his economic program. When Hamilton lays out the details of his economic reports to Congress in the early 1790s, he's not talking about old-fashioned farms and plantations and real estate. because in the medieval period and the later colonial period in America and in Europe as well, property was not viewed as a commodity. Property was viewed as just that, land, property. And one's position and one's influence in society, one's status, one's ability to influence the thinking of other people, one's position to be consulted when society is making important decisions because you are a person that matters. All of that was contingent on the property you owned, on the land you owned. And so therefore, property was not just a commodity. It was the basis of your position and your status and your wealth and your power and your reputation and everything else. So therefore, people would not be inclined to sell it. People would not be inclined to break it up and sell it in pieces, or to invest it, to sell it and get the capital to invest. Property that we would call a commodity, which has a monetary value, that has a value in dollars and cents, that's the kind of investment property, capital, that Beard's talking about. And he's talking about, again, securities and investments and bonds and bank account and money out at interest and credit and those loans that you've made that are due back to you with interest, and commercial ventures and investments in shipping companies and in cargo and in transportation and insurance and all the rest of them. He's talking about a totally different kind of property. And it seems to me what characterizes the kind of property he's talking about is the idea of commodity. It's something you regularly sell and reinvest. It's not something you hold on to in order to establish position and status and influence and power and reputation and all the rest of it. So the very nature of property has undergone change. And what Beard's talking about, what Beard is saying in 1913, is it's important to recognize that many of these delegates who went to the Constitutional Convention were not your landed aristocracy, your property in the traditional medieval sense of sitting on landed estates and owning thousands or hundreds or thousands of acres. That still exists, primarily in the South. But what he's talking about is commodity-like property. The kinds of property that is to be invested. And that's the kind of property that becomes very valuable under Hamilton's financial program in the early 1790s. Because what Hamilton does under his funding proposals and his program of assuming state debts, he wants the federal government to refund the national debt. In other words, to total up all the money that the old Confederation Congress owed to anybody, whether it was other countries or individual citizens who bought bonds. It's kind of like, remember, many people used to invest their money in savings bonds. And the idea was you take $18.75 and you go to the bank and you buy a $25 savings bond. And if you hold that bond to maturity, which usually used to be 10 years, then in 10 years it's worth $25. So you have made, in 10 years, you have made $6.75 profit on your $18.75 investment. And so what that savings bond is a security. It's an investment. It's a gamble in the sense that you are banking on the fact that it's going to be worth more when it matures than it is when you bought it. And that's why Hamilton is so intent on this new government under the Constitution making good on its promises. This government, unlike the previous one, will pay its debts. And Hamilton wants not only the debts that the old Continental Congress or the Confederation Congress owed, but he wants the new central government to assume the debts, outstanding debts of state governments as well. In other words, all the money, not only that the central government borrowed in order to win independence, but all the money that the states' governments borrowed as well to equip and arm the militia and to buy food and feed the troops and all the rest of it. All of that, whatever it was, Hamilton wants all of that debt to be brought together under the new federal government, under the Constitution. But he doesn't want the government to pay that debt. Hamilton's goal is to make good on it by paying the interest. What Hamilton wants is for people to bring in proof of this debt, proof that they hold it, by bringing in copies of the certificates, by bringing in their bonds, their savings bonds, if you will, whether they are bonds issued by the central government or whether they are bonds issued by the state governments. He wants all of it to be brought into the federal government and converted into new bonds, new securities, new IOUs, which will bear 6% annual interest. In other words, what Hamilton is saying to the people that own this debt, you bring it in and verify that you own it, that you hold that debt, and we will give you a new certificate which will pay 6% interest per year on what you are owed. The difference is that this government has the power to tax and the power to regulate trade. So this government will have the kind of income that it can make good on its obligations, at least to pay the interest. Hamilton does not want the government to pay the principal, because as long as this government owes the debt holder will remain a supporter of the government. You don't turn on those who owe you money. So if this new government is paying you 6% a year and is really paying it, and only very slowly eating into the principal, then Hamilton is effectively buying your loyalty to the new government through his economic program. So he doesn't want to pay it off. He doesn't want that loyalty to the new government to be terminated. He wants it to go on and on and on. And he knows that if people get a regular check from the government, they will continue to support the government. And so his economic program is designed to accomplish just that. The assuming the state debts, he doesn't want the states to be paying on these debts. He wants everybody to look to the federal government to pay their debts. So by assuming the state debts, he is turning people's loyalty from their states toward the new central government. He is building support among the people who matter most for the new government by putting the new government into debt to the tune of tens of millions of dollars right away. It's buying the loyalty of all the people that Hamilton believes you have to have with you in order to make this nation work. Now, all of that is well and good. It's a solid economic plan. Here's what makes it interesting. What if I knew that Hamilton was going to do that and you didn't? What if I knew that you held debt? Let's say that you had been serving in the Massachusetts militia and the state of Massachusetts owed you 3 years' salary. And now the federal government has assumed the debt, and it's going to pay you 6% interest on everything you own. Everything that's owed you, the new government's going to pay you. Let's assume that I knew Hamilton was going to do that, but you didn't. So the result would be that I would be banging on your door, and I would be saying to you, I understand you have an old security from the state of Massachusetts. That Massachusetts from the 1780s, from the War for Independence, owed you a certain amount of money. And you'd probably say, yeah, I've got this security in my bureau, in the drawer, that's, the government owes me $1,400. But I've never been paid, and they keep saying I'm getting interest, but nobody ever pays it, so it's worthless. It's not worth the paper it's written on. And I say to you, I'll give you $500 cash right now for your $1,400 IOU. Chances are you'd probably say, hell, that's a good deal. Better $500 than nothing. And it's looking like I'm never going to get anything out of this. So therefore, you would be more than happy to sell your IOU to me for $500. The difference would be that I know that I'm going to be able to go into the new federal government and take that $1,400 and get face value for it plus 6% interest. And I'm acting before you find out that that's what the government is going to do. The record of the first Congress shows that Congress suspended the vote on Hamilton's program for 2 weeks in order to give the members of Congress time to go back to their home districts and buy up these securities before they passed the law. Can you believe that? Hamilton made it possible for those people who knew what was happening, who knew the right people, to get rich from from this new government by speculating in these securities. And so the result is there's this wave of speculation that goes on. And the fact of the matter is that many of the people that come into the new federal government to convert their old debts, their old bonds, into new ones, are not the people who originally incurred the debt. Many of the soldiers from the state militias or from the Continental Army, from Washington's Continental Army, who were originally issued the IOUs, no longer have them. They sold them to speculators. And so the result is Hamilton's program produces the most incredible example of speculation, proportionally that one of the greatest examples of pure profit and speculation and self-interest that the nation has ever experienced. And the reason we know this is because under the new federal government, there are records. The new federal government keeps records. On this date, you brought in this number of public securities valued at this much, and we issued new securities valued at this much with 6% interest per year. And the difference is the new government began to pay them. And so what you find is that the people who knew the right people are redeeming incredible amounts, dollar amounts, of certificates under Hamilton's program. This is the kind of investment, this is the kind of property that Hamilton's program is designed to attract and designed to address. This is what Beard's talking about. Can you deny? I mean, the records are there. Is it possible to deny the fact that this didn't happen? You can go to the Federal Record Office, and you can open the page to a certain date. You can see this name turned in this amount of dollars, this name turned in that amount of dollars. And it's not only business people and investors and financiers. It's members of Congress, members of the Senate, members of the prominent families. For example, Hamilton marries into the Schuyler family in New York. The Schuyler family turns in tens of thousands of dollars worth of public securities under this program. In fact, there's an incredible exchange of letters between Abigail Adams and John Adams. When John is sitting at the Capitol, is sitting in New York as Vice President of the United States under Washington, and Abigail is writing and telling him, John, you're too obsessed with this idea that property is land. Yeah, we got the farm back in Braintree, and it's worth a lot, and there's a lot of buildings on it, and it's valuable and all that. But the real money is to be made in investment, in securities, in stocks and bonds. And then she laments to her cousin, and she said, I try, but I love John, and he's a wonderful guy, and he's a wonderful husband and father, and all the rest of it. But I can't make him understand that he's wasting his time trying to take this little profit and that little profit and invest it in land. The real investment potential is in stocks and bonds. And that means you have to have a government that is committed to making good on these obligations. You can't have a government which is susceptible to the whims of the majority who don't own these. They don't care about these stocks and bonds. They don't want the debts paid. So we need a government whose commitment will be to property, this kind of property. We need to create and support a government that'll make good on the kind of property that's going to make this property go, make this nation go, and allow this nation to develop. And that's the kind of property that Charles Beard is writing about. He calls it personality in order to separate it from real estate. You can't call it realty because it involves so much more than real estate. Let me give you just a sampling. This is from Beard. Let me give you just a sampling of a survey of some of the economic interests of the members of the Constitutional Convention itself. Here's just a number of examples. These are specific facts. A majority of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were attorneys. A majority. Most of the members of the Constitutional Convention came from towns at or near the coast, regions where personality was largely concentrated, the big cities, the seaports, not the plantation system in Virginia and Georgia and the rest of them, but the Baltimores and the Philadelphias and the Alexandrias and the New York Cities and Providences and Bostons. These kinds of places where personality would be most... Obviously, this is sectionalism. No wonder the South has gone out of its mind even this early, because the government adopts an economic plan which clearly is benefiting northern cities, investors, merchants, financiers, bankers, manufacturers. So right away, the South sees itself as being at a disadvantage under this Constitution. Not one member of the Constitutional Convention represented in his immediate personal economic interests the small farmers or the mechanics. Not one member of the Constitutional Convention was a small farmer or a mechanic or an artisan or a person who worked with his hands in the cities. They all represented the larger personally interests that Beard's talking about. Beard points out that at least 5/6, the vast majority of the members of the convention, at least 5/6 of them were immediately, directly, and personally interested in the outcome of their labors at Philadelphia, and to a greater or lesser extent were direct economic beneficiaries from the adoption of the Constitution. 5/6. That's a pretty powerful majority of the delegates. Let me go into a few more details. Public security interests. These are the investments in bonds, public securities. Public security interests were extensively represented at the Constitutional Convention. Of the 55 members who attended, no less than 40 appear on the records of the Treasury Department for sums ranging from a few dollars up to more than $100,000. This is $100,000 in money valued in 1792, 91 and 92. And these are all records in the Treasury Department. 40 of the 55 convert securities. Now remember, Forrest McDonald made the point in his We the People that a lot of these people bought the securities during the speculation after. It's one thing to say that they invested in and profited from securities, but it's something quite different to say they owned the securities before the convention, and therefore that's why they voted the way they did. That's something different. Beard can't prove that. And McDonald is successful in refuting a lot of that. But I think it's unbelievable. 40 of the 55 delegates. It is more interesting to note that except for New York and possibly Delaware, Beard says, each state had one or more prominent representatives in the convention who held more than a negligible amount of securities and who could therefore speak with feeling and authority on the question of providing in the new Constitution for the full discharge of the public debt. It's obvious that so many people in the convention held public securities that when the issue of the government paying off its obligations to creditors came up, it was guaranteed to pass. Then he talks about, Beard talks about personality invested in land. We talked about landed estates being the basis of one's position or one's influence. But at this time, we're talking about the West and land companies who basically buy up hundreds of thousands of acres in the West and in the Northwest and break it into plots and sell it to hungry landowners. And many of these people invest in that property, not with the idea of holding it as part of an estate, but of turning it over at a profit. It's kind of like today, people you know who flip houses, who buy fixer-uppers and throw a coat of paint on them and turn it over for a profit. That's what these people are doing with Western lands. So obviously, they want a constitution that establishes the power of the central government over the Western territories, Article 4 of the Constitution. Personalty in the form of money loaned at interest was represented by at least 24 members. 24 of the 55 members of the convention were creditors. Somebody owed them money. Tenants, people who owed them rent, something. But 24 of the 55. Personality in mercantile, manufacturing, and shipping lines. At least 11 members were directly invested in commerce. Here's one that you don't think about. Personality in slaves. We're not talking about slave owners here as some sort of a social institution. What Beard is talking about is those people who bought and sold slaves as a commodity. 15 members. So while as slave owners, these people would be expected to oppose Hamilton's program, for example, in the 1790s because it benefited the North and the Northeast, the fact of the matter is those who made their living in buying and turning over and reselling slaves, to be honest, it's kind of like used cars. Let's talk about it. Isn't it the idea that people who get into the used car business and go to auctions and buy cars and fix them up, put them on the lot, and sell them? People did that with slaves. And these slaves were not looked upon as people. They were looked upon as property, as commodities. That gives you a flavor of what Beard is talking about. And his position is it would be naive to believe that people invested in this kind of property who earned their living and literally made their fortune and spent their lives buying and selling in a commodity market like this, whether it's securities and bonds or whether it's slaves or whether it's lending money or whatever the heck it is, it would be naive to assume that they put all of this on the shelf, put it all aside when they went to the Constitution Convention and just voted their ideological commitment to Republican government. I can remember Merrill Jensen used to say all the time in seminar when I was in graduate school, there are people out there who believe that, but his position is, if you believe that, they are out of your mind. People don't behave according to principle. They behave according to self-interest, is what Jensen used to argue. Well, that's what Beard's saying. But he's not necessarily saying that they operate 100% according to self-interest. There's this mix. And I think if you look at the writings of people like Adams and Jefferson and some of the others, you can see that many times these people become torn because they are investors. Jefferson obviously was an investor in slaves. He had a huge amount of money invested in slaves, as did Washington. But that doesn't mean that they're inhuman. And so obviously there's a mix, there's a balance. And you can find in their private papers the sense that they are conflicted over a lot of these things. And that's pretty much Beard's position. The other thing that Beard points out is that if you look at ratification, a very small percentage of eligible voters ratified the Constitution. Beard says it was about 5% of the free people in the colonies who were involved in ratification. No more than 160,000 people when the population was in the millions. So basically what Beard is arguing is that these considerations, these interests, may not have dictated what's in the Constitution, but they clearly affected what's in it and their willingness to vote for it based on the fact that these things were in it. And if you consider these issues, and then you go back and look again at Madison's vices of the American political system under the Confederation, you can begin to realize that it's these people who are the most considerate and virtuous citizens in Madison's terms. It's these people who Madison defines as the minority who are not being treated fairly and equal according to the rules of justice, but rather according to the power of an interested and overbearing majority. To give the people who owe the debts the power to make policy over the people who hold the debt, the creditor, from the creditor's perspective, would be ludicrous. And that's what they believe the Confederation does. And Beard is pointing that out. And I have to believe, and we're at 57 minutes after the hour here, so we have to wrap up our program today, and our time this week. We'll be back again next week. But let me just close by making this problem, this particular point. It would be naive to believe that since so much of the Constitution focuses on these issues, and so many of the people who were involved in drafting it and voting for it were directly involved and invested in these issues, it would be naive to believe that the two didn't affect each other. But it is understandable that the William Tower Tafts of the world in 1913 didn't want the nation and the young people of the nation who were attending our public schools to see this stuff. So consequently, I challenge you, how many teachers of our children of American history even know who Charles Beard was? Think about that one. As I thank you for being with us today and invite you to come back and join us again. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for being with us. Be safe. We'll be back again next time. Thank you.